The letter arrived on a Thursday, which was the same day Warren Calloway stopped breathing. Alden found it tucked inside his father's coat pocket, while the doctor was still in the next room. It was sealed, but the wax had softened from the heat of a dying man's chest, and it came open without much effort. Inside was a single folded page, and at the top, written in his father's slow, careful hand, were 3 lines that Alden read 4 times before he fully understood them. I made a promise to a man I owed my life to. His daughter has nowhere left to go. Her name is Nora. Marry her, Alden. Do this one thing for me. There was an address at the bottom, a town called Hester Bluff, 2 days east by horse. Alden folded the letter, put it back in the coat, and sat down on the floor of his father's bedroom with his back against the wall. But he stayed there until the doctor came out and told him what he already knew. He was 31 years old, owned 400 acres of dry but workable land, and had never in his life done anything his father asked him not to. That was the arrangement between them, unspoken but understood. Warren Calloway was not a man who asked for much. He fixed his own fences, settled his own debts, and never once complained about the drought years when the cattle grew thin and the money grew thinner. He had raised Alden the same way, quietly, firmly, with the understanding that a man's word was the only thing that could not be taken from him. And now, from beyond the threshold of death, Warren Calloway was asking for one last thing. Alden spent 2 days on the ranch doing what needed doing. He fed the livestock. He repaired a section of fencing along the north pasture and told his hired hand, Pruitt, to keep things running while he was gone. He did not explain where he was going. Pruitt was smart enough not to ask. On the morning of the 3rd day, Alden saddled his horse, put the letter in his breast pocket, and rode east toward Hester Bluff. He did not know what he expected to find. He had constructed no image of her in his mind, which he felt was the wisest approach. She was a stranger. She had a name, Nora, and an address, and apparently a situation desperate enough that her father had called in a debt from a dying man. That was all he knew. That was all he allowed himself to know. Hester Bluff was smaller than he expected. One main road, a handful of storefronts, and a church at the far end, with a leaning steeple that looked like it had been arguing with the wind for 20 years, and losing. Alden tied his horse outside the general store and asked the man behind the counter if he knew a woman named Nora, boarding somewhere nearby. The man gave him a long look before answering. "Mrs. Hadley's place," he said. "End of Birch Street. But I'll tell you what I tell everybody. Mrs. Hadley don't like strangers coming to her door without cause." "I have cause," Alden said. He walked to the end of Birch Street and knocked. The woman who answered was not Nora. She was older, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had made its decisions about people a long time ago and rarely revised them. She looked Alden over from boots to hat brim without any particular hurry. "You're a Calloway," she said. But it was not a question. "Yes, ma'am. Alden Calloway. Warren's boy." "Yes, ma'am." She studied him one moment longer, then stepped aside and let him in. The house was clean and close, smelling of pine soap and something baking. Mrs. Hadley led him down a short hallway and stopped outside a door at the end. "She knows you're coming," the old woman said quietly. "She's been knowing for 2 weeks. Doesn't mean she's ready." She paused. "Doesn't mean she's not, either." She knocked twice, then left him standing there alone. The door opened, and Alden Calloway, who had ridden 2 days and buried his father and held himself together through all of it without once losing his footing, felt something shift in his chest that he could not immediately name. She was not what he had expected. He could not have said what he had expected. But it was not this. Not the stillness of her. Not the way she stood in the doorframe, as though she had already rehearsed this moment 100 times, and was now simply enduring the real version of it. She was composed in the way that people are composed when composure is costing them something. Her eyes met his and held there. "Mr. Calloway," she said. Her voice was steady. Practiced, maybe, but steady. "Miss Nora," he said. A silence opened between them. Not uncomfortable exactly, but full. The kind of silence that holds more than either person is saying. "You didn't have to come," she said finally. "I know," he said. "But you came anyway." "My father asked me to." She looked at him for a long moment after that. Something moved behind her eyes, something careful and quick, and then it was gone. "Come in," she said. I'll make coffee." They sat across from each other at a small table by the window and spoke for 2 hours. She asked about the ranch. He told her plainly. The acreage, the cattle, the state of the well, the distance from the nearest town. He did not dress it up. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she nodded slowly, as though she was measuring something. He asked her very little. He sensed, without being able to explain how, that questions would close her off rather than open her up. So he waited, and slowly, carefully, she offered small pieces of herself. She was 26. She had no family left that she was close to. She could cook, keep accounts, tend a garden, and ride well enough to be useful. She said all of this in the tone of a person presenting qualifications for employment, and Alden noticed that she never once mentioned where she was from. He noticed. He said nothing. Before he left that evening, they had reached a quiet agreement. He would return in 4 days. They would be married at the church with the leaning steeple. They would ride back to the Calloway ranch together and begin whatever this was going to be. She walked him to the door. He put his hat on and turned to go. "Mr. Calloway," she said behind him. He stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping his promise." He looked back at her once, that composed, careful face, those eyes that held something behind them he could not quite reach, and nodded. He rode back to his lodging in the dark, and for the first time since his father died, he did not think about grief. He thought about her eyes, and the thing they were not saying. The wedding was a quiet thing. There were no guests to speak of, only Mrs. Hadley, who sat in the third pew with her hands folded and her expression unreadable, and Pruitt, who had ridden out to meet them and stood near the back wall, turning his hat in his hands, like he wasn't sure what to do with himself. The preacher was a thin man named Eds, who performed the ceremony with the careful efficiency of someone who understood that not every wedding was a celebration. Alden stood at the front of that small church and watched Nora walk toward him. She wore a dress the color of riverstone, gray-blue, simple, nothing borrowed about it. Her hair was pinned back neatly. She carried no flowers. She walked at an even pace, eyes forward, chin level, and Alden had the sudden and inexplicable feeling that she had walked into difficult rooms before, that this was not the hardest thing she had ever done. That thought stayed with him all the way through the vows. They spoke the words the preacher gave them. Alden meant his. He suspected Nora meant hers too, in whatever way she was capable of meaning things right now. When Eds pronounced them married, Mrs. Hadley made a small sound in the back of the church that might have been approval or might have been something else entirely. Pruitt clapped once and then stopped, apparently unsure if clapping was appropriate. Nora accepted Alden's arm as they walked out into the afternoon light. Her hand rested on his forearm lightly, the way a bird lands on a fence, present but ready to lift off at any moment. But the ride back to the Calloway ranch took most of 2 days. They spoke more on that ride than Alden had expected. Not about anything large or meaningful, about the landscape mostly, about the way the color of the rock changed as they moved west, about a hawk they both watched riding a thermal above the ridge for nearly 10 minutes without moving its wings. Small things. Safe things. But Alden was beginning to understand that with Nora, small things were not small. Every word she offered had been considered before it left her. Every question she asked had a reason behind it. She was not a woman who spoke carelessly, and that told him more about her than anything she had actually said. On the second evening, they made camp beside a dry creek bed where a few cottonwoods still held their leaves. Alden built a fire, and Nora made coffee from the supplies she'd packed, with a quiet efficiency that suggested she had taken care of herself for a long time. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, and the silence between them was different from the silence at Mrs. Hadley's table. It was looser somehow, less rehearsed. "You're not what I expected," Alden said. He hadn't planned to say it. She looked across the fire at him. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone more—" He paused, choosing carefully. "Uncertain." She considered that. "I am uncertain," she said. "I'm just quiet about it." He nodded slowly. That was one of the most honest things anyone had said to him in recent memory. "So am I," he said. She looked at him for a moment, really looked, at the way she rarely did, and something in her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not warmth exactly, but the door to warmth opened just a crack. Then she looked back at the fire and finished her coffee. The Calloway Ranch appeared on the horizon late the following afternoon, a low sprawl of buildings set against a ridge of pale limestone, the main house solid and weathered, the barn newer and better built than everything around it. Warren Calloway had always trusted his animals more than his own comfort. Nora said nothing when she first saw it, but Alden noticed her sit slightly straighter in the saddle, and her eyes moved carefully across the property the way a person's eyes move when they are trying to memorize something, or trying to decide if it is safe. Pruitt met them at the gate and took their horses without being asked. What he nodded at Nora with the careful respect of a man who had been briefed on the situation and chose to ask no questions. Alden showed her the house. It was clean but sparse, a working house, not a decorated one. Warren Calloway had lived alone for 11 years since Alden's mother passed, and the rooms had taken on the quiet austerity of a man who had stopped caring about anything beyond function. There were no curtains in the kitchen. The sitting room held 2 chairs and a bookshelf, and nothing else. The bedroom Alden had prepared for her was small, but had a south-facing window that caught the late light beautifully. She stood in that room and looked at the window for a long moment. "It's good light," she said quietly. "I thought you might like it," he said. She turned and looked at him then, with an expression he couldn't fully read. Grateful, maybe, or something more complicated than grateful. "I'll try to be useful," she said, "to earn my place here." Something about the way she said it, "earn my place," sat uncomfortably with him. "This is your home now," he said. "You don't earn a home. You just live in it." She looked at him for a moment, as if that idea was genuinely new to her. Then she nodded once and turned back to the window. The first weeks passed in careful rhythm. Nora rose before Alden each morning and had coffee ready by the time he came in from the early feeding. She kept the house with quiet precision, not obsessively, but thoroughly, in the way of someone who found steadiness in order. She planted a small kitchen garden along the south wall, without asking permission and without announcing it. One morning, Alden simply looked out the window, and it was there. He said nothing about it, but he smiled once when she wasn't looking. She was careful around him in those early weeks, polite, considerate. She left space between them at all times, physical space, conversational space, as though she was waiting to understand the rules before she committed to anything. Alden gave her that space without resentment. He understood in his way what it was to need room to figure things out. But he watched her, not in a way that crowded her. Just, he noticed things. The way she sometimes stopped in the middle of a task and looked south toward the road, her expression going somewhere far away before she pulled herself back. The way she never mentioned Hester Bluff or anything before it. The way she had arranged her few belongings in the small bedroom with the south window. Everything essential, nothing sentimental. No photographs, no letters, nothing that pointed backward. People who removed all evidence of a past were not people who had simply moved on from it. They were people who were afraid it might follow them. It was a Tuesday evening in the third week when Alden came in late from mending fence on the north pasture to find Nora standing in the kitchen holding a piece of paper. She had not heard him come in. For just a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3, he saw her face completely unguarded. And what was on it was not the careful composure he had grown accustomed to. What was on it was fear. Old and specific and deeply familiar to her, the way fear only looks when a person has been carrying it for a long time. Yet then she heard his boots on the floor, and the composure came back instantly, like a curtain pulled across a window. She folded the paper and slipped it into her apron pocket in one smooth motion. "You're back late," she said. Her voice was perfectly even. "North fence," he said. He hung his hat. He washed his hands. He sat down at the table, and she set a plate in front of him and poured his coffee, and they ate together the way they always did, quietly, comfortably, with the easy conversation of two people who had learned each other's silences. But Alden had seen what he had seen. And later that night, lying awake in his room, with the sound of the wind moving through the eaves, he thought about that piece of paper, about the address at the bottom of his father's letter, about the way she always looked south toward the road, that he did not know who she really was. But he was beginning to understand that, whoever she was, something was coming for her, and that when it arrived, she intended to face it alone. He decided, quietly and without ceremony, that he would not allow that. He wasn't sure exactly when he had made that decision. He wasn't sure, if he was being honest with himself, that it had anything to do with his father's promise anymore. That troubled him more than the mystery did. The rider appeared on a Friday. Alden saw him first from the barn, a single figure coming up the south road at an unhurried pace, the kind of pace that belongs to a man who is not afraid of what he will find when he arrives. He was well dressed for the frontier, riding a dark horse that cost more than most men in this territory made in a year. He had the easy posture of someone who had never once in his life been told no and believed it. Alden set down his work and watched. The rider stopped at the gate and looked at the house for a long moment before dismounting. Then he looped his reins over the post with the casual familiarity of a man making himself at home somewhere he had not been invited, and walked toward the front door. Alden was already moving. He reached the porch before the man could knock, and they stood looking at each other in the thin morning light, Alden on the top step, the stranger on the ground below, which put them at roughly equal height, and neither of them missed that. He was perhaps 35, dark-haired, clean-shaved, with pale eyes that moved quickly and settled slowly. He had the kind of face that had probably been called handsome, often enough that he had stopped being grateful for it. "Calloway Ranch?" the man said. "That's right," Alden said. "I'm looking for a woman." He said it the way men say things they consider formalities. "Goes by the name Nora. I have reason to believe she's here." "There a reason you're looking?" Alden said. Something shifted in the man's expression, barely perceptible, but there, a recalibration. "My name is Vance," he said. "Elara Duval is my concern. Has been for a long time." Alden held the man's gaze and said nothing for a moment. "My wife's name is Nora," he said. "Nora Calloway. You're at the wrong ranch." Vance smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "Is she home?" he said pleasantly. "I'd like to hear that from her." Nora appeared in the doorway behind Alden before he could answer. He heard her breath catch, just once, just briefly, and then she stepped out onto the porch and stood beside him, and her face was the most composed he had ever seen it, which told him everything about how afraid she was. "Vance," she said. "Elara," he said. "My name is Nora." "Your name," he said carefully, "is whatever your father decided it was, and your father has been asking for you." Something crossed her face then, not fear exactly, but the particular pain of a wound that had never properly closed. "My father," she said quietly, "has no claim on me. He believes otherwise." Vance glanced at Alden briefly, then back to her. "We all do." Alden felt her hand find his arm, not grabbing, not clinging, just resting there the way it had on their wedding day. Present, grounded. He did not move. "This woman is my wife," Alden said. His voice was level and final, the way his father's voice had always been level and final. "Whatever business you believe you have with her, you'll conduct it through me, or you won't conduct it at all." Vance studied him for a long moment. The pleasant expression remained, but the pleasantness had gone out of it entirely. "I'll be in town," he said to Nora, as if Alden had not spoken. When you're ready to be reasonable." He walked back to his horse, mounted without hurry, and rode back down the south road the same unhurried way he had come. They stood on the porch until he was gone. Then Nora stepped back inside, and Alden followed, and she walked to the kitchen table and sat down and put both hands flat on the surface in front of her and stared at them. He sat across from her and waited. The silence lasted a long time. "My name is Elara," she said finally. "Elara Duval." She said it like a confession, like something she had been holding underwater for a long time and was only now allowing to surface. "My father is Gerald Duval. He owns most of the land between the Reyes River and the county line east of here. He is not a man who accepts things he doesn't want to accept." She paused. "Vance worked for him. Still does, I imagine. He wanted to marry me. My father encouraged it." She looked up then and met Alden's eyes directly. "I didn't want that life. I didn't want any part of what my father built, or how he built it. So I left. I changed my name. I found your father's letter through a woman who knew Mrs. Hadley, and—" She stopped, took a breath. "I thought if I was married, and settled, and far enough away that he would let me go." Alden looked at her for a long time. "Did you know anything about me?" he said. "Before you came." "I knew your father was an honest man," she said. "That was enough." Something in his chest moved at that. He wasn't sure what to do with it, so he left it alone. "What does your father want?" he said. "He wants me home. He wants me married to Vance. Yeah, he wants things the way he decided they should be." Her jaw tightened slightly. He has always wanted things the way he decided they should be. And Vance? She looked at the table. Vance loved me, she said quietly. In his way. Which is to say, he loved the idea of me and the Duval name, and what marrying into it would give him. He was never cruel. He was just... She searched for the word. Certain. About things that weren't his to be certain about. Alden nodded slowly. What do you want? He said. She looked up at him. What? What do you want, Nora? Not your father. Not Vance. You. She stared at him as though the question was in a language she was still learning. I want to stay, she said at last. The words came out smaller than she intended, he could tell. More honest than she had planned to be. I want... She stopped, but looked at the window. The south window with the good light that he had chosen for her without knowing why. I want this to be real, she said. I know it started as a promise. I know that. But I want... She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Alden rode into town that afternoon. He found Vance at the hotel, sitting in the dining room with a glass of something amber and an expression of mild surprise when Alden pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without being invited. They spoke for 30 minutes. Alden did not raise his voice once. He laid out the facts the way his father had always laid out facts, plainly, without decoration, with the quiet authority of a man who had already decided how things were going to be and was extending the courtesy of an explanation before they were. Nora was his wife. She was Nora Calloway. Was whatever arrangement Gerald Duval had imagined for his daughter was no longer a possibility, legally or otherwise. If Vance or anyone connected to Duval set foot on Calloway land again, Alden would handle it the way frontier men handled trespassing, and he would be entirely within his rights. Vance listened to all of it with those pale, quick eyes and that face that had stopped being pleasant. When Alden finished, Vance was quiet for a moment. She told you everything, he said. Enough, Alden said, and you don't care who she is, where she came from, that she came to you running. She came to me, Alden said simply. That's what I care about. Vance looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment something shifted in his expression. Not defeat exactly, but the particular resignation of a man who has finally understood that the thing he wanted was never actually his. He picked up his glass and looked at it. She made her choice, he said quietly. She did, Alden said. He stood, put his hat on, and left Vance sitting there with his amber glass and his careful face and all the certainty slowly going out of him. When Alden got home that evening, Nora was in the kitchen garden. She was kneeling in the dirt between 2 rows of something green and small, working with the focused, quiet energy she brought to everything. She did not hear him ride in. He unsaddled his horse and turned it out, and walked to the garden gate and stood there watching her for a moment. She looked up. Something in his face must have told her that because the tension he had seen in her shoulders every single day since she arrived, that constant braced quality, that permanent readiness for something to go wrong, slowly, visibly left her. She sat back on her heels in the dirt and looked at him. Is it done? She said. It's done, he said. She nodded, looked down at the small green plants. When she looked back up, her eyes were bright, in a way he hadn't seen before. Alden, she said. Yeah. I think I'd like you to call me Ilara. He looked at her for a moment, at this woman who had buried her name and her past, and ridden 2 days to marry a stranger, and planted a garden without asking, and stood on his porch beside him without being asked, and looked south down the road every day, waiting for the thing she feared, and never once asked him for help, even when she needed it. "All right," he said. "Elara." She smiled then. Really smiled. The first time he had seen it reach her eyes without anything held back behind it. It changed her whole face. It changed something in him too, something he had no immediate plans to examine, but also no intention of ignoring. He opened the garden gate and crouched down beside her in the dirt. "What are you planting?" he said. "Lavender," she said. "It takes a long time, but it comes back every year once it's established." He looked at the small, careful rows she had made. "Good," he said. "We've got time." She glanced at him sideways, that quick, careful look she had, and then she handed him a small bundle of cuttings and showed him where to press them into the earth. They worked side by side in the dirt until the light went gold, and the shadows stretched long across the garden, and neither of them said anything more, because neither of them needed to. 6 months later, Elara Calloway stood at that south window with the good light and watched her husband ride in from the north pasture, and she thought about the letter that had started all of it. Warren Calloway's slow, careful handwriting. The 3 lines that had sent a grieving son 2 days east on a horse to knock on a stranger's door. She thought about how fear had brought her here, and how something else entirely was keeping her. Alden came through the door and stopped when he saw her at the window, the way he always stopped. That brief pause, that quiet look, as if he was making sure she was still real. "Something wrong?" he said. "No," she said. And she meant it in a way she had not meant anything in a very long time. "Come here." He crossed the room. She took his hand and placed it against her middle and watched his face. The pause was longer this time. When he looked up at her, his eyes held something she had never seen in them before, something unguarded and enormous and completely unafraid. He didn't say anything. He just pulled her in carefully, the way you hold something you have somehow been trusted with, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and listened to his breathing slow into something steady and sure. Outside the south window, the lavender was beginning to take root. It would come back every year now. They both would. The end. And to everyone who made it all the way to the end of this story, wherever in this world you are watching from, and I would genuinely love to know, whether you are sitting in a warm room somewhere in the middle of a busy city, or out in the quiet of the countryside with nothing but open sky around you, drop your location in the comments. Tell me what corner of this world Alden and Elara's story has reached. It means more than you know. And if there is anything you would like to see done differently, a different kind of story, a different pace, a different kind of ending, your suggestions are always welcome here. This channel grows because of what you tell me. So tell me something. If slow burn stories like this one find a place in your evening, there are more of them waiting for you.